Drones are an essential tool for any videographer or photographer who's trying to capture stunning aerial footage. With the ability to soar high in the sky and capture breathtaking footage from unique angles, drones have really revolutionized the approach we take to videography and photography. Today, thanks to drones, anyone can capture stunning aerial footage without breaking the bank. Not only do they offer incredible creative possibilities, but they also provide a practical solution to many real-world problems. In this video, we're going to explore the reasons why a drone is a must-have for any videographer or photographer. If you've just gotten yourself a drone, whether it's the DJI Mini 3 Pro or the Mavic 3 Classic, you probably just want to go fly it right away. But I can tell from personal experience that some preparation on how to set it up so you get the most of it is probably a good idea. I've actually just gotten myself the new Mavic 3 Classic and I just love it. But don't worry, this guide is gonna work on all newer DJI drones. The very first thing you should do when you get a drone is to connect it to your controller. When you connect it the first time, there will always be a ton of updates you need to do, and I recommend highly to do all these updates because some of them is for flying safety and some of them is just firmware updates for the actual drone. When that is done installing, I will do all the calibration that is needed. I do this just to make sure that nothing goes wrong when I'm flying and the drone is up to date with all the calibrations that is needed. If you go into the settings, you can see all the calibrations you can do, and I would do all of them. And when this is done, you're basically ready to take your first flight. Just be aware of local laws so you don't break any rules while you're flying the drone. But if you really want to make the most of your drone, there are still a few things inside of the settings you can do so you get the best footage you can possibly get. If you have any of the newer drones, you will most likely have a color profile called D-Log. D-Log is the log profile that DJI makes, and it's actually pretty great for color grading as well. This means you get the most information out of the footage, and overall it will be easier for you to color grade the footage afterwards. If you're just starting out and don't really care about color grading, I would not recommend shooting in D-Log because this is something you will only shoot if you're trying to color grade your footage and make it look in a certain way. Then I also like to turn on the grid, which just makes it easier for me to compose the shot. And I also like to turn on the zebras because I can really see if my footage is overexposed or not. If you've done all of these things, I would say that you're now ready to go fly your drone. So let's go out to a place so that I can actually show you some of my favorite movements and why I use them. We've now come out to a location here where I can show you a bit more about some of the techniques I use to get more dynamic shots with my drone. We're gonna start out with some easy shots that's pretty easy to do, and then we're gonna move up to some more advanced stuff that will take some practice to get used to. Before we take the drone in the air, there's a few things I would recommend you do. The first thing I want you to do is to play around with the pitch speed of the gimbal. This means you'll have to figure out how fast you want the gimbal to go up and down. I'll put up the settings I use on the screen now so you can try them out if you want to. When you figure out the settings you really like, it's time to practice. You want it to get so dialed in that they become second nature to you so you don't waste any time when you're out shooting. The second thing I want you to be aware of when you're using a drone, and I think a lot of people neglect this, is that you use the 180-degree shutter rule. This means that if you're shooting in 24 frames per second, your shutter speed needs to be 1/50th of a second. If you're shooting in 60 frames per second, your shutter speed needs to be 1/120th of a second. When you put the shutter speed that low, it means that your footage can also get really overexposed really easily. And to compensate for that, some drones you can turn out the aperture, but some drones you can't. And if you can't do that, I would highly recommend getting an ND filter. I would get a variable ND filter, which just makes it easier for you when you're on the shoot, so you don't have to switch out the ND filters all the time. And in that way, you make sure you get the right shutter speed and make the footage look as natural as possible. Now let's get into some of the movements you can do while you fly the drone. So let's start out with some easy movements that won't take long to learn, but also look kind of basic. The first one is the orbit. The orbit is one of the easiest movements to learn, especially with the DJI drones, because you have something called active track. With active track, you just draw a square around the subject and then you move the drone to one of the sides. This will automatically make an orbit. As it's tracking something, it will go around the subject. One thing to be aware of is that not all drones have sideways sensors, so look out for stuff you can fly into. The next movement is the top down. The top down shot is as easy as it gets. You move the gimbal 90 degrees down, so you're filming from top down, and then you just fly up. But to make it a bit more interesting, I usually do a small spin on the drone, so there's a bit movement in the shot as well. The last one of the easy movements is to just fly straight forward or fly straight backwards. These shots are great to show off a wide landscape or to reveal something if you go close to the subject and then fly backwards. If you're just starting out with a drone, I would recommend learning these three movements in the beginning, as they're really easy to learn and they get you kind of the basics of how to fly a drone. And then it is also not the biggest risk to fly like this. The next movement we are going to talk about is a bit harder to learn because we're using 2 axes instead of just 1. This means we will be doing 2 things at the same time. And if you learned all the previous things I talked about, you will also feel a bit more confident flying the drone, so you will also most likely be able to take some more risks when flying. The first movement of the mediocre movements I would like you to learn is again the orbit, but this time we'll do some more things. You can still use the active track here and track a subject. So when you have tracked the subject, you will fly sideways, but try starting a bit further down or a bit further up. While you're going sideways, you will move the left dial up or down. This means you will both be flying in an orbit and you will move the drone up and down. By doing this, you add a bit more dynamic into the shot, which is always good when you're shooting with the drone. The next movement is not that hard as well. This is just like flying straight forward or backwards. But while you're flying forward or backwards, you will tilt the gimbal up or you will tilt the gimbal down. With some of the drones, you can have the gimbal tilt further up than the 0 degrees, which means you can go from top to down. But with all of them, you can have the gimbal tilt from down to top. This also adds a bit more movement to the shot, and I usually use it as a reveal shot. If you really want to make the shot interesting, I would recommend trying to fly close to something. So either go close to a subject or flying close to the ground. This adds a lot of movement in the shot, and you can really see the motion blur if you're following the 180 shutter degree rule. And the last thing we're going to talk about in the mediocre level is either doing an easy movement or a mediocre movement, but try to fly close to something in the foreground. This is really something I've been trying to do lately, as in my opinion it adds an insane dynamic into the shot, plus it makes the movement you're doing way stronger because you have something in the foreground you're moving past. Just do it at your own risk because it can go wrong sometimes. Advanced movements, in my opinion, is when you start merging all the things we've learned before together. This means that you're using all 3 axes of the drone and sometimes even 4. The first movement is again the orbit, but this time you'll not be able to use the active track. This is because you're gonna use the gimbal manually. The way to do this is you go around in an orbit, but you manually have to turn the drone so it has focus on the subject. While you're doing this, you will fly up or down, plus you will be tilting the drone up or down. When you've mastered this, you can make it even more interesting by flying close to something. So use something in the foreground or come up from behind an object and you reveal something as a subject. With these movements, it's really important that you dial in all the controls on the controller. So you know how much the gimbal is gonna go up and down when you turn the knot and how fast it's gonna go from side to side. But when you've dialed them in and you've done them enough times, these will become second nature from you and you won't use that much time getting them. Which means you can get more interesting shots as well because you have more time on the drone. With the next movement, I have one thing to say before we talk about it. Do this at your own risk. Recently, I've been trying to fly way more aggressive. This means I'm flying through things, I'm flying close to some edges, I'm flying just a bit more risky. But for you to be able to do this, you need to turn off the sensors. That is really what makes the flying risky because the drone is not going to stop by itself. So if you're flying into something, you will crash the drone. But if you succeed by flying aggressive, you will get some really insane shots. One tip I have for you if you want to do this is only do it when you know you can retrieve your drone if you crash it. So if you're flying it through a tree or something, make sure that the tree is not too high up so you can't retrieve the drone again afterwards. The last movement is kind of hard for me to explain what I'm doing, so I think it's just easier for me to show you. With this movement, I would actually recommend using the active track as it just makes everything so much easier. You will fly towards a subject, and when you get close to the subject, you will fly around the subject while you're going pretty fast up. And if you succeed doing it, you'll get something just like this. So yeah, that's basically how I fly my drone, and there's probably way more ways to fly the drone and get dynamic shots and really interesting shots, and I can hopefully learn more about those in the future. But let's get back into the editing cave and take a look at how you can improve your footage in the post. Even though I believe most of the work is done when you're shooting the video, there's still a few things you can do in post to make your video look a bit more interesting. The first thing I'm going to talk about is color grading. I'm not going to go into depth about how I color grade or how you color grade overall. I just wanted to talk a bit about what's the difference between color grading drone footage and camera footage. Drone footage is usually a bit harder to color grade and you can't do as much manipulation as you can with camera footage. The reason why is on drones you usually have a smaller sensor in the camera, which means you have less data to work with. Nonetheless, you can sometimes shoot in D-log, which is the log profile from DJI, which means you will have a bit more data to work with. And if you take a look at some of the footage I have from the Faroe Islands, you can really see that this footage is a log profile and it's really flat and doesn't really have contrast or colors. But as you turn on the colors in the footage, you can really see how it brings back some life into the footage. The one thing I would be aware of when color grading drone footage is the more you manipulate the colors and the contrast and just overall the footage, the more noise you will have inside the footage. Luckily, DaVinci Resolve Studio has a really great noise reduction and that usually fixes the problem for me. Another thing we can do, and this is especially useful if you have some footage that you think look kind of basic. What I'm talking about here is to do a small push in or a push out. So if you take a look at some of the footage I had from the Philippines, you can see that this footage is really slow and it's kind of basic. So now you have two options to do as push in or push out. You can either go up to the transform tool here and go into the zoom, and then you can make a keyframe here in the beginning, and then go to the end of the clip and make another keyframe here. I want to do a push in here, so you can do 1.2, and as you can see now, it just adds a bit more dynamic into the footage, and in my opinion it looks way better. Another option you have, which is something I've started doing a lot lately, is something called dynamic zoom, and it's just down here. Normally it's turned off, and that's because you don't use it in normal footage like talking head as I'm using now, but with footage like this it comes in handy a lot. So you turn it on and you can already see that it's zoomed in automatically. If I just press play now, it will do a push out, and it is really easy. If you want to change how much it pushes out, you go into this drop down menu here, and then you press on dynamic zoom. You can then choose where it's gonna start. So right now it's gonna start with the green square and go out to the red square. If you want to do it other way, so it's gonna be a push in, you just click down the menu with dynamic zoom and then you click swap. Now the green square is on the outside and you can see that it's gonna zoom into this frame. So let's play back. So that was some of the techniques I use, the settings I use, and what I do in post to make my drone footage look good. In my opinion, drone footage is really something that adds a lot of value to your videos, and it really fits well if you're switching between drone footage and camera footage, and it can really help you take your videos to another level. So take the time to learn these movements and techniques, and I promise you, you will feel way more confident flying a drone, and you will get way happier with the footage you get from it. I really hope you learned something and enjoyed the video, and if you did, I would really appreciate a like on the video, and maybe you will consider subscribing to my channel. I will see you in the next one.